9. That is how many nations currently possess nuclear weapons. 9 sets of launch codes, 9 command structures, 9 different definitions of rational behavior, 9 different historical traumas, 9 different domestic political pressures, 9 different answers to the question, under what circumstances would we actually use these things? The machine called mutually assured destruction was engineered for 2 players. It was stress-tested for 2 players. It almost failed for 2 players, multiple times. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Able Archer 83, a NATO military exercise in 1983 that the Soviet Union briefly believed was the cover for an actual first strike. The Petrov Incident. Vasily Arkhipov on submarine B-59. We barely survived the learning curve. We are now running it with 9. There is a concept in international relations theory that runs counter to most people's intuitions: the stability of bipolarity. The idea that a world with 2 dominant powers, competing but roughly equivalent, is actually more stable than a world with many competing powers. The argument runs like this: with 2 dominant powers, each has complete clarity about who the threat is. Communication channels are direct and well established. Each side knows the other's capabilities with reasonable precision, because each side has invested enormous intelligence resources in knowing. The rules of the game, what constitutes an unacceptable provocation, what will trigger retaliation, are understood by both sides and have been tested carefully through decades of crisis and negotiation. The Cold War had a hotline. It had arms control treaties. It had backchannels. It had, eventually, something resembling a shared language for discussing nuclear risk, a language developed through the terrifying education of events like Berlin, Cuba, and the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the United States briefly raised its nuclear alert status in response to Soviet threats to intervene in the conflict. Scholars like Kenneth Waltz, the most influential international relations theorist of the 20th century, argued that this bipolar clarity made MAD more robust than most people recognized. Waltz went further. He argued, controversially, that the spread of nuclear weapons to more nations might actually increase stability by extending MAD's deterrent logic more widely. His argument: if every regional rival pair, India and Pakistan, for example, reached mutually assured destruction capability, the logic that prevented the US and USSR from fighting directly would prevent them from fighting directly as well. The problem with Waltz's argument is the 4th pillar, rational leadership. MAD works when both sides are rational and both sides know the other is rational. In the bipolar Cold War, despite several very close calls, both sides were ultimately governed by large bureaucratic institutions with enough inertia to prevent any single irrational actor from launching unilaterally. The Soviet Politburo, the American Joint Chiefs and civilian oversight structures, the nuclear football existed, but so did the chain of command and the safeguards, and the institutional memory that said, "This must never happen." In a multipolar nuclear world, the institutional safeguards are not equivalent across all 9 players. North Korea's nuclear arsenal is controlled by a hereditary authoritarian with no meaningful institutional check on his authority, and who, in 2023, formally announced plans to exponentially expand his arsenal and mass-produce tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. Pakistan's weapons have been managed through a complex and occasionally contested civil-military relationship in a country that has experienced multiple coups. And Israel, the 9th flag, maintains a policy of nuclear opacity so complete that the country has never officially confirmed its arsenal exists, even as every serious intelligence agency on Earth has estimated it at between 80 and 400 warheads. An undeclared nuclear arsenal presents a unique deterrence problem. Israel's Samson option, the doctrine of last resort nuclear retaliation if the state faces existential destruction, functions as deterrence only if adversaries believe it is real. But because Israel cannot officially confirm its arsenal, it also cannot clearly communicate its red lines. What triggers the Samson option? No one outside a very small group of Israeli officials knows. That ambiguity is both the point and the danger. These are not Cold War conditions. Of all the nuclear dyads that concern strategists today, India and Pakistan is the one that most frequently appears in serious worst-case analyses. And for good reason. The two countries have fought 4 wars since independence in 1947. In 1947, 1965, 1971, and 1999. The 1999 Kargil War was fought after both countries had conducted nuclear tests in 1998, making it the first military conflict between declared nuclear powers since the Cold War ended. Both sides managed limited escalation, and the war stayed conventional. But the margin was not comfortable. A 2002 crisis, triggered by a Pakistani-linked terrorist attack on the Indian parliament in December 2001, brought the two countries to the brink of conventional war for nearly a year. 1 million troops mobilized along the border. American diplomacy, specifically Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage's intervention in Islamabad, was widely credited with pulling both sides back. But the crisis revealed something sobering. In a fast-moving escalation between India and Pakistan, the window for diplomatic intervention might be much shorter than the window for rationality. Nuclear strategists describe this as the stability-instability paradox. The presence of nuclear weapons at the strategic level creates a kind of stability. Neither India nor Pakistan will launch a full nuclear exchange because both understand the consequences. But this strategic stability paradoxically enables instability at lower levels. Each side believes it can engage in conventional military action, or support for non-state actors, or limited border skirmishes. Because nuclear escalation is, presumably, off the table. Presumably is doing enormous work in that sentence. The danger is what strategists call escalation dominance, the idea that each rung of the escalation ladder can be climbed under the belief that the other side will not escalate further. Each side assumes it can control the climb. Neither side can guarantee it. Pakistan's military doctrine, in particular, has moved toward what analysts call full-spectrum deterrence, a strategy that explicitly includes the use of tactical, battlefield-range nuclear weapons to offset India's conventional military superiority. Pakistan has developed and deployed short-range nuclear-capable missiles, the Nazar system, with a range of roughly 60 kilometers, specifically designed to be used on the battlefield against advancing Indian armor. Not against cities, against tanks and infantry columns on Pakistani soil, in the middle of a conventional war. The implications of this are severe. If India launches a conventional military operation in response to a terrorist attack, and Pakistan responds with a tactical nuclear strike on Indian forces, on Pakistani territory, what does India do? India's official nuclear doctrine says any use of nuclear weapons against Indian forces, anywhere, triggers strategic nuclear retaliation. Meaning, Pakistan uses a small battlefield weapon. India destroys Pakistani cities. Is that credible? Would India really escalate to city-killing retaliation in response to a tactical strike? Maybe not. But if India doesn't, Pakistan's doctrine works. And Pakistan has effectively established that it can use nuclear weapons for battlefield advantage without triggering Armageddon. And if India does retaliate strategically, 200 million people die in the first exchange, and the nuclear winter that follows disrupts global food production for a decade. This is why the India-Pakistan dyad appears at the top of most nuclear risk assessments. Not because the leaders are irrational, because the logic of their doctrines, followed consistently by both sides, leads to catastrophe even without anyone making an obviously wrong decision. The most significant structural shift in the global nuclear landscape of the 21st century is not North Korea's provocations. It is not Pakistan's tactical weapons. It is China. and what China's nuclear expansion means for the architecture of arms control that has, however imperfectly, helped manage nuclear risk since 1968. For most of the nuclear age, China maintained what strategists called a minimum deterrent. A relatively small arsenal, perhaps 200 to 300 warheads, sufficient to credibly threaten retaliation, but not designed for first strike capability or numerical superiority. China's nuclear doctrine was explicitly no first use. We will not use nuclear weapons against any nation that does not first use them against us. This is changing rapidly. China has loaded more than 100 ICBMs into newly constructed silo fields. It is developing a full nuclear triad: land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and air-delivered weapons that mirrors the American and Russian triads. The United States will, for the first time in its history, face two peer-level nuclear adversaries simultaneously: Russia and China. This creates a mathematical problem that the Cold War bilateral framework never had to solve. Arms control, the treaties that placed verified limits on how many weapons each side could build and deploy, was always fundamentally bilateral. The United States and the Soviet Union negotiated SALT I, SALT II, the INF Treaty, START, New START. All of them, two parties. Both sides could verify each other's compliance. The numbers could be agreed to because there were only two sets of numbers. In February 2026, New START, the last major nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, expired. Russia had suspended its participation in 2023, citing the Ukraine war. The United States allowed it to lapse. For the first time since 1972, there is no binding treaty limiting the size of American and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals. We are, right now, in a nuclear arms control void that has not existed in over 50 years. And into that void, China is building. China has declined to join any bilateral arms control framework, arguing, with some logic, that its arsenal is still smaller than the American and Russian ones, and that it would be strategically disadvantaged by accepting limits while the other two powers maintain numerical superiority. China's position is coherent. It is also, from the standpoint of global nuclear risk management, a serious problem. Because if China reaches numerical parity with the United States and Russia by 2035, as the Pentagon projects, and there is still no multilateral arms control framework, the world will have three roughly equivalent nuclear superpowers, each watching the others, none bound by any treaty, none communicating through any agreed verification mechanism. That is not a stable condition. That is the setup for a new arms race, one that is already by most measures underway. Here is the honest answer to the question this series has been building toward. The 5 pillars of MAD: deterrence capability, second strike capability, communication and command, rational leadership, and strategic communication do not become more stable when you add more players. They become more complicated, and complicated systems fail in ways that simple systems do not. In a 2-player system, the number of unique bilateral relationships is 1. In a 9-player system, the number of unique bilateral relationships is 36. Each of those 36 relationships has its own history, its own grievances, its own escalation ladder, its own ambiguities about red lines and rational responses. The probability that at least one of those 36 pathways suffers a communication failure, a rationality failure, a command and control breakdown, or a strategic miscalculation in any given decade is not small. The great nuclear theorist Albert Volstetter described the stability of nuclear deterrence as a delicate balance of terror. His point was that this balance was not self-sustaining. It required constant management, constant investment, constant communication, constant attention. It required leaders who understood the machine, who had studied the theory, who had thought through the scenarios in advance. Not all of today's 9 nuclear leaderships have that depth of strategic culture. Not all of them have the institutional safeguards. Not all of them have the communication infrastructure. Not all of them have spent time at the negotiating tables where the Cold War rules were written and tested. North Korea's Kim Jong-un publicly stated in 2023 that his country's nuclear weapons policy is now enshrined in law, that the arsenal will be expanded exponentially, that tactical nuclear weapons will be mass-produced for battlefield use, and that there will be no denuclearization under any circumstances. This is a leader who has publicly renounced the logic of MAD as a constraint. He is not deterred from building. He is not deterred from threatening. The only question is whether he is deterred from using. The answer, most analysts believe, is yes. For now. Because Kim's survival depends on his regime's survival, and his regime's survival ends if he uses nuclear weapons. The rational actor calculation still holds. But rational actor in Kim's case means something quite different from rational actor in Eisenhower's case. The threshold for use, the definition of existential threat, the institutional checks on a single leader's decision. None of these are equivalent. And yet, the machine is still running. 9 flags, 9 arsenals. No nuclear weapon has been used in conflict since Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. That is either evidence that the machine is more robust than the complexity suggests, or evidence that we have been extraordinarily lucky. The honest answer is both. And we cannot know from the inside of a lucky streak whether the streak reflects the machine's resilience or the universe's indifference to our continued existence. Let me tell you what has happened to the architecture of nuclear risk management since the Cold War ended. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 was designed to cap the number of nuclear states at 5. There are now 9. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of weapons from Europe, was withdrawn from by the United States in 2019, citing Russian violations, with Russia following immediately after. The Open Skies Treaty, which allowed each side to fly surveillance aircraft over the other's territory as a confidence-building measure, was withdrawn from by the United States in 2020 and Russia in 2021. New START expired in February 2026, with no replacement framework in sight. One by one, the structures that manage nuclear risk have been dismantled. Not because they stopped working, because the political will to maintain them has eroded. Because in a world of more than 2 players, bilateral agreements feel incomplete. Because domestic politics in nuclear states have made arms control a liability rather than an asset. What replaces these structures is not a better framework. What replaces them is nothing. We have gone from an imperfect but functional architecture of managed nuclear risk to an unmanaged nuclear competition between 3 peer powers, the United States, Russia, and China, with 6 additional arsenals of varying stability operating around the edges. There is a sentence in the literature of nuclear strategy that I want to leave you with. It is not from a pacifist. It is not from a protester. It is from Albert Bolstetter, a man who spent his career thinking, rigorously and without sentiment, about how nuclear weapons work and how to make their use less likely. This is not an argument for despair. The machine has run for 80 years without firing. The human beings assigned to its management, the Stanislav Petrovs and the Vasily Arkhipofs, the Anatoly Dobrynyns and the McGeorge Bundys, the arms control negotiators, who sat across tables for years in Geneva and Vienna working out the details of treaties that nobody celebrated and everybody needed, have more often than not made the right call in the dark. But the machine does not maintain itself. It does not correct for irrationality. It does not resolve the instability paradox. It does not automatically generate the communication infrastructure that 9 nuclear powers need. It does not build the multilateral frameworks that 3 peer competitors require if they are going to coexist without eventually destroying each other. Those things require human decisions. Political decisions. The decision to treat arms control as essential infrastructure rather than optional diplomacy. The decision to engage adversaries we find repugnant because the alternative is a world in which we are all equally dead. The decision to invest in the slow, unglamorous, deeply unsexy work of tending the machine. Mutually assured destruction is not a strategy. It is a condition. We created it. We live inside it. We cannot turn it off. Every generation that has lived inside this machine has had to decide whether to tend it carefully or to let the maintenance lapse and trust to luck. We are the generation that has, so far, chosen to let the maintenance lapse. The counter, the number of days since Nagasaki, keeps climbing. Every day it climbs is evidence of some kind that the machine still holds. The question is not whether we have been lucky. We have been lucky. The question is whether we are going to do anything about it before our luck runs out.